Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Nikhil Ramdev. I'm a senior associate at MRP Advisory. I'm the host today, and I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Dilip. He's a renowned litigation funder in UAE and globally. Thank you, Mr. Dilip, for taking out time from your busy schedule and being with us today. Uh, for the sake of our audience, can you please briefly introduce yourself and the work that you do and your firm does?
Sure, happy to do that, and thanks for having me, Nikhil. So a little bit of background on myself. Look, I'm quite a bit older than you, so I don't want to go into an extensive background because that could take up the whole time. But I think what's most relevant is the following. As you could tell from my accent, I'm from the United States. I grew up in New York, was born in Bombay, but my father started an engineering and construction firm in 1973 in New York. And as a result, I grew up listening to disputes, delays, and design claims from the time I was maybe 3 to 4 years old. So I always knew I could help my family if I became a lawyer, right? So I became a lawyer. And even before I was in law school, I was trying to help resolve these kind of disputes. So that was in my blood. Ultimately, we did open offices coming back to our origins, two in the Middle East, two in India, which really gave me a lot of exposure at a young age to international cross-border issues in multiple jurisdictions. And that served me well as investment flows began happening through all three areas. In After the financial crisis, I partnered with a very large hedge fund from the United States. We started an asset recovery business focusing on the sovereign wealth funds, the banks here, the large investors who lost money in the products that had been created prior to that, right? So mortgage-backed securities, collateralized loan, and in doing that asset recovery business, what were our tools? Forensic audit, global asset tracing, and of course, funding lawyers in multiple jurisdictions. So as I started getting more active in that in 2012, I moved to the UAE at the behest of some of the people here who said, "We really like what you're doing. We need you in the local ecosystem." And then I met a lot of British lawyers when you come to Dubai around the DIFC, and they started telling me I'm a litigation funder. And so I said, wow, that turns everything I do into two simple words. And we ran with that nomenclature for the rest of the time. And in 2019, I set up my own firm with a family office. We were making our own bespoke investments in legal assets, as we call it. And then in 2023, I was introduced Argentem as a special situations firm, uh, private credit focused on emerging markets. The footprint is Latin America, Eastern Europe, have been very involved in Asia over its history, and now with an Abu Dhabi office, the Middle East, Africa, and India. And as we got to know them with what they do in special situations, private credit, in emerging markets, you really have to understand the legal system and how to enforce your rights. And lo and behold, they had been funding their own disputes at some time. And it was just a perfect match of me wanting to be in a bigger global platform. And quite honestly, also wanting to use different skill sets with the legal assets and litigation mindset, but be able to be much more creative with capital. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it sounds great. Thank you for the introduction, and it's such an enriching experience that you have elaborated. Uh, so moving on to next, I just want to understand how does litigation funding work, and what types of disputes are most commonly funded?
So, look, I think you probably know how litigation funding works. It's very simple, right? A third party steps into the shoes alongside, in the best case scenario, with a claimant and assumes the financial risk, right, of funding the claim. That means funding the lawyers, maybe it's funding the experts, court fees, etc. So at its basic level, that's the simplest answer I could give you as to how it works. It's a assumption of risk, a transfer of risk, a sharing of risk, and a sharing of reward.
Yes.
And
So
and you asked about what kind of cases are getting funded. or what
Yes.
kind of matters they're funded. Look, I've been doing this since 2009, 10, so it really depends on what part of the world you're operating in, right? If you're in the United States, we have such a big torts industry with treble damages. A lot of the bigger cases are mass torts claims. Uh, Such a big economy, so many commercial claims, such a litigious society, right? So quite creative in what gets funded. The UK, I think, also has quite a diverse industry, though we're seeing a lot more, let's call them group actions evolving. I have to tell you that I've probably lost a little touch with Europe over the last few years. Australia had started with class actions in the mining industry. So I think it's really depends and is very jurisdiction specific. In emerging markets where we have a lot of infrastructure projects, we're going to see a lot of construction claims. A lot of time we have joint ventures, right, between a foreign player or local party. Those may end up in a dispute. I think we're seeing in some emerging markets the maturation of the bankruptcy regimes, and we're starting to see restructuring, insolvency, and claims coming out of that, and even the sales of non-performing loan portfolios. So it's very broad and very different, and yet can be somewhat jurisdiction specific.
Thank you so much for explaining it in such a simple way for our audience. So moving to the next. So what do you think are the key factors funders consider before financing a case?
So, we used to say the four pillars of litigation funding. And that used to be really the merits. Is it a good case or not? The jurisdiction. Are we comfortable with the courts, the legal system? Is it common law? Is it civil law? In some places, we may have a little touch of Sharia law. So is it something that is we can understand, right? And is not terribly opaque to us? Obviously, the amount of the claim investment. So you want to see a good multiple of the claim amount. I think also collectability. Are we going to be able to collect? Are we going to be able to enforce on the claim? And I think over as we've done this, what is the fifth factor, which is very important, is time. Time is the biggest issue that we have because there's opportunity cost and you don't want your investment to go beyond what you may have calculated because your return goes down. And I think the industry is facing now is duration risk.
Exactly. I totally concur with you. So what do you think how mature is litigation funding market in UAE compared to other jurisdictions?
Well, look, if we compare it to the US, UK, Australia, um, I think it's almost similar to some of the Southern European countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, where we're seeing it. But I will say, look, in the last 15 years, it has matured. I think in the beginning, it was just myself and Joseph Durkin running around waving this flag. Joe is now with Burford. It has evolved because we have Burford here. We have Omni Bridgeway. We have a handful of local participants who have come. And industry has understood it, right? Construction firms are starting to say, well, maybe there's some balance sheet relief here. Lawyers who are very connected in other jurisdictions understand it and are showing it to their clients. And we've seen the sales of NPLs from some of the banks to, the enforcement side comes into the litigation funding, really, right? So you've got some of the big funds starting to buy that. It is maturing, but it's not as nascent as it may be in India or in other places.
Certainly. So as you have already pointed out, in India, litigation funding is still at a nascent stage. So what do you think are the biggest challenges you see in this market?
India is always that way. It's such a massive opportunity, and yet it's so challenging, right? So, look, if you ask me, and I have my own biases of things I'd like to see, to me, I like to see an alignment of interest, right? And so we have that issue in the UAE where I'd like to see more success fees and and modified fee arrangements. I want to see lawyers have some skin in the game. Every Indian lawyer is always promoting, hey, I have this case, but that's great because they're going to get full billables on it. So I'd like to see some evolution in that. Everyone has been afraid of the lengthy duration of the court processes in India, which you count in decades, right? Oftentimes. Um, and then there are some basic things that I think, as foreign direct investment environment is improving, had been challenges. Currency risk, tax risk, how do you get your money in and outside of India? I think, look, what I'd like to see is a domestic Indian industry, a market as big and with so much talent as India should be able to support domestic litigation funds. Then we'll see some, greater global interest. Though I will say the green shoots are there, particularly around the insolvency industry. I mean, you see Burford funded this Go Air claim. I think we're seeing interesting arbitration awards. Unfortunately, many of them are against the government of India. So that's where you end up in another head scratching exercise. And so, look, I think it's still very early days, but a lot of smart people are working very hard to make it happen. And I think it will.
Certainly, certainly. So what role do you think major arbitration institutions like ICC, SIAC, and others play in facilitating third-party funding?
I think they play great roles and, very foundational roles. Firstly, many of these arbitration rules, right, and guidelines allow for third-party funding, right? And we've seen SIAC, we've seen Singapore allow it. That's often the way a jurisdiction starts, is with allowing arbitration to be funded by a third party. I think they also give a great comfort to investors because it's not a opaque process. You can see who the arbitrators are, the qualified lists of arbitrators. You can see a lot of international commercial claims being brought there. And then we have the comfort of the New York Convention, depending on the parties, to say, hey, can I go enforce this in any of the 100+ jurisdictions around the globe? So, look, I think it's very helpful that institutional stamp on it, and seeing something that's going through one of those processes is something that an investor would be interested in.
Indeed. Thank you for the perspective. So my next question, though you have briefly touched upon an earlier question, so I'll still ask it just out of curiosity. How do funders assess the enforcement risk of awards issued under institution like SIAC, ICC, especially for jurisdictions like India and UAE?
We look at in jurisdictions like India and UAE, it's still tricky when you think of how do I get this? Well, UAE may be a little less so because we have the Abu Dhabi Global Markets, we have the DIFC. So can I take the award? Do I need to get it, recognized, ratified, et cetera? And then does that give me the power to go onshore to attach assets? That can be the tricky part. If the defendant has assets in those jurisdictions, great. So, look, we have that filter that we look at it through here. I think India is a lot more challenging because the recognition process is sometimes unclear, opaque. India, has recognized but not signed certain treaties. And then if you think, oh boy, how am I going to go enforce in the local court against a piece of land in India and
Yes.
transfers and look, also you also have to be very wary. How many other local creditors are there? And then you're way behind those local creditors. So the funders will or investors will also say, where else do they have assets? Yes,
Yeah.
they may have assets in India. Do they have assets in the UK, Canada, etc.? Same thing in the UAE. You have to take a global perspective of these things.
Thank you. So as you spoke about the global perspective, so what do you think are the biggest global challenges in litigation funding?
I think a global challenge, and yet I think it's a good part of the evolution, is we're seeing regulation now come into place. in various jurisdictions, right? The United States is essentially 50 plus different jurisdictions. So courts are starting to rule on issues of disclosure, issues as to the limits that funders can take as a return. We're seeing, some issues in the UK now. I can't remember the specific cases. So I think even in Australia, it's different per part of Australia right now. So the rise of regulation and the sort of the instinctual reaction, like, oh, this is bad, this is frivolous, this is speculation. That perception then that makes leak over into, some regulatory side, that can be a challenge. So that's what I see as the challenge. The other thing too, I learned when I feel that the industry gets overhyped and too many people are entering the industry and funders are coming and going so quickly. So
Okay, understood. So, in cases involving state-owned entities, how do funders manage political and enforcement risks?
very carefully, very judiciously. Um, Again, look, particularly in the era we live in, I don't think anybody wants to be adverse to a political regime or a sovereign nation, right? Um, so we're settling these because you'll see a series of cases. Hey, if they are inclined to settle, then that's not a bad thing. I think that oftentimes in enforcement, they've looked for assets on a global basis, so you don't have to come into the home country. But I tell you what's worked for us is we've always, and because we've sort of been very creative as investors, we've always looked for a settlement channel. And I think it's really helped us at times when we say, look, we've seen this claim. It's not really good for anyone that this goes to court or is adjudicated. It's better for everyone to settle this. And if you can find the right conduit, whether that's a former ambassador or you have relationships, look, when they're resolved, it also becomes a nice indicator for foreign direct investment, the resolution of disputes. And many of these jurisdictions are encouraging foreign direct investment. So I think you have to take a two-pronged approach. If we have to go the contentious route, that's it. But if we can go a collaborative route, we'd prefer to go a collaborative route.
Very interesting. Thank you. So, as you spoke about settlements, so how does litigation funding influence settlement strategies?
I guess, one way would be the perception from, let's say, the defendant. If I am in a dispute and now I see that the other side has funding and it's properly disclosed and may be required, um, now I'm going to, that will sort of adjust my thought process as to, well, they clearly have the resources to see this all the way through. So I think in the best case scenario, it should actually help more cases settle. And also even the scales, because you might be against a big corporate defendant that has been a wrongdoer. But if you have a funder and you are, individuals or a class of persons or a wronged party, I think it at least evens the scales and makes the likelihood of settlement more increases the likelihood of settlement.
Oh, thank you so much. So, the next question is certainly I am very curious to know about. So, do funders play a strategic role in case management, or is their involvement purely financial?
I'll tell you, it's in our experience, my experience, it's very jurisdiction and case specific. Like certain jurisdictions, right, the funder has to just be a financial partner, should have no influence over the outcome. Um, and that's right and fair because you also don't want a funder not to accept a settlement when it might be in the claimant's perspective. So so, but in other instances, I think particularly in emerging markets, our experience has been a group may come to you and say, look, we have a portfolio of lawsuits. But our legal team, their job is they should not be running lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, or it's an investment group that says, look, now this has gone wrong. We want to see what are our rights. We want to enforce our rights. So I think there are times when you can be really strategic, you can add strategic value. Or in the instance, like I said, where you may have a relationship that can promulgate a settlement. The other thing is in some instances, funders also do have in-house asset recovery, in-house for asset tracing, in-house forensic audit, and even in-house quantum experts. So if you have that ability to, I think, run litigation cost effectively, look for a win-win, and you have resources that the law firms and the claimant say, wow, this is great. We don't have to expend more money or time and stretch our resources. It can be strategic, but again, it's very case specific and jurisdiction specific.
Understood. Thank you. So, what advice would you give to businesses looking to secure litigation funding?
I would say you should, to businesses, absolutely explore it because look at litigation funding or legal finance as sort of non-bank finance, right? Where someone who's in the legal finance industry can look at what in some instances may appear to be liabilities on your balance sheet and actually say, oh, this is an asset. We can help you monetize that asset. We can help um, free up your cash flows and free up your team's time appropriately. So I think for businesses, it can be a very effective resource. But I would tell businesses also, that they have to temper their expectations and manage expectations because funders take a long time to do their diligence, as well as as you know, the overwhelming majority of cases do not get funded. So certainly explore it. It can be a great resource as well, but also manage your own expectations.
Certainly. So, if someone wants to pursue a career in litigation funding, what advice would you give to the aspirants?
I think for any person pursuing a career, making a career decision, the first question is, why do you want to do that? Right? What is it that's attracting you? A Now let's assume everybody is a lawyer that we're talking to, or an aspiring lawyer, or a law student. So what is it that you don't want to be in a typical law firm? You don't want to be pressured to billable hours? Fair enough. But you could look at legal tech. You could look at many other things. You could look at going into a special situations firm, a credit firm where that legal knowledge of legal complexity and the ability to understand the process is still very useful. Um, do you love disputes? If you love disputes and you say, but I want to now look at this from an investor standpoint, again, I would encourage you to think it through a little bit, but be very careful and do your homework on where you are applying for this position because there's been a lot of turnover in the funding industry. It's still a nascent industry. And make sure that if you're making that kind of a life decision, you're going to a place where you're going to be mentored and is well resourced.
Thank you so much for the insightful session, Dilip. Looking forward to more such conversation. I am sure our audience will be delighted to listen to this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikhil. It was a real pleasure. Take care.